So with that, I will kick off. My name is Laila. I am the head of design, research, and accessibility operations at Xero. And that pretty much just means that I look at optimizing processes, scaling systems, embedding change, and improving the accessibility of our digital product. And to tell you a little bit more about what Xero is, I just thought I'd give a little bit of an intro. So Xero is a global small business platform that provides accounting, payroll, payments, and other solutions for small businesses, accountants, and bookkeepers. The company was founded in New Zealand. We've got a really large presence across New Zealand and Australia, and we also have customers based in the UK, as well as the States, Canada, South Africa, and I think a very small presence in Asia. So that's who Xero are, just to give you a bit of context for my examples. So before I really dive into my talk, which is all about how I broke my finger, and the really timely reminder it gave me of the role that lived experience plays in making us better at making our products more accessible. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about you so that I can do a better job of tailoring this talk for you. So I'm going to push a poll live, and the intention of the poll is just to understand who we've got in the room in terms of accessibility experience. So I believe I have pushed it live. And then the request is for you to choose the category that suits you best. And I believe I selected the option that the results will publish once all of the answers are in. So let's see how that goes. I can see percentages are coming in now. Oh, I love that we've got at least one person whose job it is to make digital products accessible. And then we've got some others, which is good because I find finding these categories a bit polarizing, right? Because it forces you to choose an option, and sometimes they just don't fit. So I did add in another. All right, now let's close the poll and have a quick look at the results. So we have 30% of the room who are new to digital accessibility, so welcome, and I'm really looking forward to sharing more with you. We've got 40% who know a little bit about digital accessibility, and then 20% whose job it is to make accessible digital products. It doesn't look like we've got anyone who's working in a digital accessibility team or driving accessibility forward in the organization. So there are a lot of people who don't have an official digital accessibility title, but are actually unofficially doing a lot of that grunt work. We're always exceptionally grateful for those people. And then we have one other. So I'll just have a quick check in the chat to see if we've got details. All good. All right, I'm going to continue with that. So good to know that we're sort of at that majority is sitting in that learning mode, which is excellent because this talk is really targeted at that space. So great. So my digital accessibility journey. For me, my experience with digital accessibility started as a personal one. My younger brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 19. And when I returned home from travels in 2008, I became his carer. And one of the observations I had in being his carer was that it was incredibly difficult for him to do things in a digital environment because of where he was at mentally. And he found online forms particularly difficult. So he would get told to go find accommodation, and that required looking on websites to find flatmates or share houses. And he found it really difficult to navigate around and understand where he needed to go, and he needed to fill in forms to get access to his disability benefits. And again, that was difficult, and the same with looking for employment. So I would help him with all of those interactions. Then in 2016, I took on a role with Coles Coles Group. So for those of you not familiar, Coles is one of the two big supermarket players in Australia. They have about 800 supermarkets across Australia, as well as a similar number of liquor stores across 3 different brands. And at Coles, I was the delivery manager of digital experience and accessibility. And this was the first time that digital accessibility became part of my job. And honestly, prior to that, I had never even thought about how people with disabilities might use technology beyond my brother's context. So when I was provided the opportunity to embed digital accessibility at Coles, I was really excited because I understood why it was so important. And it was that why that led me to take the role. So Coles had been sued because their website was not accessible for people using screen readers. And it was my job to help them to release a new accessible website and to ensure that all of their products moving forward, all the e-commerce platforms would be accessible. During COVID, my husband, my kids and I decided to move to New Zealand. And that's when I took on the role of head of digital accessibility for Xero. And similarly to Coles, my job at Xero was to establish the capability. Although Xero was a little bit more mature in their understanding of digital accessibility, and they had a lot of champions already operating within the organization. And obviously my title, it's long and silly now. I've got 2 extra teams. I don't just have accessibility, but when I started, I was just looking after accessibility. And then lastly, the last part of my story, probably not the last bit, was that in 2021, my eldest son was diagnosed with ADHD. And so we return again to me thinking about and having a very personal experience with disability and using technology. He's very confident in technology, and so far he's doing quite well, but who knows what the future holds. And then lastly, I have astigmatism in my left eye, and that means that I really don't like dark mode. And I understand I am in the minority here, I believe, but I find dark mode super difficult because of my astigmatism. So that's me and accessibility. So today I really want to talk about why considering people's lived experience is important and how it makes you better at designing, building, or testing for the digital accessibility of your product. And I want to do that so that you can think about ways to embed lived experience and disability into the way that you do your day-to-day work. So I'll kick off with what happened. So I've got 3 images on this slide, and I will describe them a little bit for those that maybe can't see them. So I have a picture of my dog Lucia, who was a puppy at the time, about 5 months old. Lucia is a short-haired dog who's predominantly white with big black spots, and she's got some brown on her face and some lovely floppy ears. I also have a photo of an X-ray. So essentially what happened was I was a little bit distracted when I had Lucia out on a walk. I had my 2 children with me, and I was not properly holding her dog leash, and she bolted for a leaf. Like I said, she was a puppy. She loves bolting for leaves, and the leash caught my little finger and essentially twisted it to break it. At the time, I didn't realize I'd broken my finger. So by the time I presented to what they call it, White Cross here, essentially it's not the emergency department. It's like a service that operates between a GP and an emergency department. And they informed me that I would need to have my finger re-broken to reset it because it had started to sit in a funny position. And that resulted in me having my arm casted. So I have an image of the break, and then I also have an image of my left hand in a cast, which covers all of my fingers. So I had only the use of my thumb, and that cast went to about my elbow, and I was casted for 2 weeks. All right. So what was the outcome of that? So essentially, I found myself trying to go to work with a temporary disability. So I've included an image on this slide. It's an illustration from the Microsoft Inclusive, I think they call it a workbook, but the Microsoft Inclusive Design Principles, and it shows it's a representation, of permanent to situational disability. So I'm going to do another poll quickly to see if anyone is familiar with this model. So just bear with me. All right, it should be now open. So do you know what the Microsoft inclusive personas are? Very clear yes and no for this one. Okay, you know what, when I published the polls, it had an option to have a percentage or a count. And I wish I'd gone with the count because then I would know when the voting's finished. But that's fine, we'll feel it out. I'll give a little bit more time. Okay, I think we are there. So I will close the poll. So we've got 78% who are not familiar and 22% who are. So I'm actually really pleased to introduce those of you who are not familiar with this. So Microsoft does a really good job of talking to disability in general and helping designers and developers to understand what different disability types are and what the different needs are in each of those groups. And I do provide a link in my presentation later to those, so you'll be able to have a look at them. It's interesting because you go to a web page, but then you have to download the book, the guidebook, to access it. So you're not in the wrong place if you're suddenly downloading something. Essentially, what they outline here and what I've shared is the fact that the needs that someone has who has a disability permanently, so known as a permanent disability, are the same needs as someone who has a temporary disability and the same needs as someone who has a situational disability. And it's really just helping you to understand that when you make products accessible, not only are you taking away barriers for people with disabilities, which is something we should absolutely be doing, but you're also making life easier for people who have a temporary or a situational disability. And so there's three visuals in this slide. There's a visual of someone who has just one arm, which is a representation of a permanent disability. Then there's a visual of someone who's wearing a sling, which is like myself with a temporary disability. And then there's also a visual of a person holding a baby who has a situational disability. So when they're holding the baby, they only have the use of one arm or one hand. So, what were my needs when I found myself casted? The first was that I needed to work. I needed to continue to work. Xero is incredibly generous with their wellbeing leave, but I felt with a broken finger, I needed to keep working. So I did. And essentially, my first need was something that would help me to type because I couldn't use my left hand to type anymore. Now, when I'm at work, I work across many platforms. So we use predominantly the Google Suite, but I also spend my days in Miro, Asana, Jira, Workday, Slack. The list goes on. We use an extraordinary number of tools at Xero. We are very fortunate that we get to use a lot of great tools. But that actually meant that I needed a solution to help me to type across all of those platforms, which actually made me feel quite overwhelmed. How was I going to find something that I could use across everything in the same way? The next need that I had was that I needed to maintain my productivity. So I needed to be able to attend the meetings that I would usually attend, write the emails and the Slack messages I would usually write. And then lastly, I needed something that was user friendly, so that was intuitive and easy for me to learn because I didn't have lots of time to invest in learning about accessibility, not accessibility, learning about using the new technology. Okay, so I can just see there's a comment. Don't agree with the concept of situational disability. Those examples are rarely disabilities; they're just inconveniences. Absolutely, and I don't think you're wrong in what you're saying. It's not to say that people with situational temporary disabilities actually have fit the formal definition of disability. It's just saying that their needs at the time align much more closely than they do typically. And it's to, I've found working in the digital accessibility space that lots of people will often pull the conversation back to how many of our customers have a disability. And that's a really unhelpful spot to get into, because what it ignores is the fact that uh, the accessibility of your product benefits so many people, not just your customers with disabilities. And if the conversation is only about your customers with disability, and this is an unpleasant reality, then you typically struggle to get the work prioritized because the number isn't large enough. And it's not fair and it's not right, but it's really common. So what I find the inclusive personas from Microsoft help us to do is to have a more productive conversation about how widespread accessibility needs are, because they are really, really widespread. And we actually have found it both in both the orgs I've worked in, when we've started to collect information about access needs, the access needs are much higher than the number of customers that identify with disabilities. And so we have a better conversation when we talk about the access needs across the org. All right, I will keep going. So what did I do? Well, I called for help. Xero has a really active Slack community, and I've included a screenshot of my call for help in Slack, and it says, has anyone used voice to text in Slack on a MacBook? So I just wanted to start with a very simple, how do I figure out how to use Slack? Because that's my day-to-day comms. And I got a response pretty much immediately. Okay, I'll just go to the next slide. And the outcome was Mac dictation. So I was very lucky. Mac has an inbuilt tool called dictation, and you can activate it in your settings, and then you can just double click. I'm pretty sure it was control, and then you can speak to your computer and it will type out what you said. And so I was able to very successfully use Mac dictation across all of my applications with a little bit of editing. And if this had happened now, because we've just had Gemini enabled, I would have been using dictation and then using Gemini to edit and put in punctuation. As it was, I would just speak the words and then edit with my right hand because I had that available. Now, I alluded to it a little bit with answering the question before. My experience is not the typical of experience of someone who lives with disability and uses technology. In fact, my experience is not representative at all. The reality is that 1 in 6 people experience some form of disability, and only 3% of websites are fully accessible. And that number has barely budged in the 20 years that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have existed. So there's an enormous challenge ahead when it comes to making digital products accessible for people with disabilities. And if we just think about that disability statistic for a moment, when I thought about the 1 in 6, I tried to find another example as well. What's another 1 in 6 ratio? And I found one. It's vegetarianism is pretty close. So there's about 1.2 billion people that live with disabilities, and there's about 1.5 billion people who are vegetarians. And I wonder how we would all feel if suddenly, or how vegetarians would feel if suddenly only 3% of websites were accessible for them. So this brings me to the role of lived experience and why I wanted to talk about it, because I'd obviously broken my little finger. I knew intimately what barriers existed for people with disabilities when using digital products. But what it made me realize is that the role of lived experience is really pivotal in people understanding and really committing to working on the digital accessibility of products. And so I tried to think of other areas where we need lived experience to truly understand. And I listed some of the things that I'm familiar with. So parenting is one of those things that is very difficult to understand unless you've been there, as is redundancy, grief, any sort of chronic illness. And also painting a ceiling was one of those things that I honestly had no idea was so challenging until I'd actually done it. And the whole point of me sharing these examples is to really explain that it is the human condition to not be able to truly understand how something feels unless we're in those shoes. And so we need to think about, as digital practitioners, how we overcome that very human side of ourselves to make our technologies more inclusive. So I was going to list out the errors that we make without lived experience. So the first is underestimating the impact. So underestimating the impact of accessibility barriers on productivity and user experience. And what I mean by this is we can miss the key issues to solve if we don't understand what it's like for someone with disabilities to use our product. And I have an example here. I had a designer working on, I believe it was a drop down, and she really was trying to make it accessible, and she thought she'd found a great solution. We then did some user testing with some customers that were screen reader users. And what we discovered really quickly was that that accessible solution was actually not usable at all. And that it was going to add 5 or 6 additional clicks for our screen reader or keyboard only users, which just wasn't acceptable. And so therefore by looking at the impact of the solution with customers with disabilities or screen reader users, we were able to understand that we hadn't chosen the correct solution. The designer then worked really hard with the engineers to find something different, which was still accessible but didn't add in the extra clicks. And this actually relates to my next point, and the next error, which is around overlooking context. So overlooking the challenges of using assistive technologies in real world work environments. So if we go back to my context and my needs, I needed something that was cross-platform, that maintained my productivity and was usable. Let's think about the context quickly of Xero customers. So Xero customers are accountants and bookkeepers, or they're small business owners. And some of our accountants and bookkeepers build their time in 6-minute increments. And our small business owners are often quite stressed and are not always going to their accounting software with knowledge of accounting or finance. And so our customers are typically time poor, needing to do things really quickly, and sometimes they're just stressed. And so we need to remember this context when we're making our product accessible, or we really miss the mark for our customers. So it's not good enough for us to just say, oh, look, this complies with the global standard. What we actually need to do is look at the context that our customers are in when they use our product and consider that alongside the global standard to make sure that the way that we're making the product accessible is actually the way that works in the job that those people are trying to complete when they're in our product. And then the last error that we tend to make when we don't have lived experience is we have a lack of urgency. And this is due to that human condition I mentioned before, of just not being able to understand and experience until we're in those shoes ourselves. And it's much easier when you haven't lived the experience to maybe feel like another bug that you've got in your large backlog of things to fix is more important than making your product more accessible. And that lack of urgency really impacts our ability to take away barriers for people with disabilities when using our products. So what can we do about it? How can we improve? Well, this isn't going to surprise you based on the title of my talk. We can embrace lived experience. So we can actively seek out and listen to the experience of people with disabilities. Lead with curiosity, learn. When you're learning, go beyond the theory. So it's really important to engage on hands-on experiences with assistive technologies. Turn on dictation in your computer and try to not type for a day. Activate a screen reader on your mobile phone to experience apps and checking your email using screen reader only. Try the different assistive technology that's available to really try and understand the experience that people that use those technologies are having when they're using everyday products and your product. And lastly, foster inclusive collaboration. So create inclusive work environments where people with disabilities are involved in the design and the development processes of your product. And within some organizations, this takes time because the system isn't set up very well. But the place we absolutely have to start as a minimum is to test with people with disabilities. We need to test our products with screen reader users and people that identify as having disabilities to make sure that we are creating something that meets their needs and meets the context they have when they're using our products. So I have shared a very busy slide and I don't expect people to read it. Essentially, it's just an example of an accessible presentations overview that we have in all of our templates at Xero in Google Slides. And essentially what we're saying is even though our product needs to be accessible, it's equally as important for all of our internal presentations to also be accessible. And this is part of fostering that inclusive work environment. And so the headings are things like make the language inclusive, make the text accessible, be careful with color, be careful with animations, make the non-text context accessible. And then there's lots of links and things that people use in order to do that. That's one of the many ways that we are attempting to foster a more inclusive environment at Xero. This is my second last slide. So where to start, given we've got a lot of people that are relatively new, I highly recommend the Web Accessibility Initiative's Accessibility Fundamentals page. I believe it's a very accessible page. As I'm not a screen reader user, so I can't validate that. I could go and check it and test it. Really great place to start for your accessibility resources and learning about accessibility. In terms of engaging and listening to people with disabilities, I recommend the Stella Young TEDx talk. I'm not your inspiration. Thank you very much. It's a really great talk. And then lastly, the Microsoft Inclusive 101 guide book that I've referred to is a really excellent resource. There are so many resources available on digital accessibility. As soon as you understand why you need to do it, you won't find a shortage of materials or people that are willing to help you. And with that, I will wrap up and try and catch up on the comments.